Back on the stream once again. It's been a while, and this one's going to go back to a close reading of a text that I teach a lot. In fact, one time I in a very stupid decision, used this pretty complicated piece in a job interview where I had to teach a class in a very short amount of time. And I got the job. I turned the job down, but I got the job. But I'm not sure if it was because of this or despite of this, because I think they kind of all were looking at me like, what the hell is this? It's kind of a weird reading. It's pretty strange. And I came upon this actually through a friend of mine. His name is Nick Stefanski. And I'm sure he'll never see the stream, so I feel free to talk about him and acknowledge him. He is someone I've really, my thinking has been really deeply informed by him and his kind of contest with me sometimes, testing some of my humanist ideas and saying, you got to think about technology and the material realities of things, the mathematical side of things. And that's really helped me kind of challenge my own thinking and think about things in new ways. Weirdly, we've found some common ground in this guy, because he wrote another book. I can't even say where he's from. He lived in Brazil for a long time. His name is Vilém Flusser. He lived in Brazil for a long time. He lived all around the world. He spoke 4 or 5 languages. Really prolific and strange man. He was a weird thinker. He wrote one book called Into the Universe of Technical Images. Hey, what's up, aliens? Aliens, what's up? Good to see you. It's been a minute. I've seen you in the Discord a little bit, but it's good to see you here. And hopefully you're doing okay. I know I believe you're in India, and I know that things, at least the news that we've been seeing here, things are pretty dreadful there, so I hope that you're doing okay, and my thoughts are with you. Yeah. I don't know if this reading will bring you any comfort, but I think there is something in here that it kind of does give me some comfort about why it's worthwhile to kind of continue to speak even when it seems, because sometimes I get the feeling I'm like, what am I doing? Like, all this is all kind of falling apart, this whole world seems to be falling apart, and the things that I hope for the world just don't seem like on the horizon to be possible at all. But this, not just this particular piece, but there are ideas that are like this one, give me some reason to be like, okay, well, even if in the big picture there's reason for pessimism, that's not the only picture. There are littler pictures, and they're worth attending to too. So that's kind of what this is. This is, in some sense, a very little picture, but not necessarily less important for all that. So I was just saying that this guy, he wrote a interesting book called Into the Universe, I think it's translated into English. I'm not sure from it. Into the Universe of Technical Images, which was written before the internet, but he basically kind of predicted that the democratization of the technology through which people could produce many their own kinds of images of any kind, video images, audio images, he had a very big idea, and it would create this totally new possibility for society, and it could go in different directions based on who was controlling the technical means behind it. It's a very interesting, weird, kind of prophetic book, and a lot of it, I wouldn't say it came true. Prophecies don't really come true. That's not how prophecy works. And he didn't call himself a prophet, but he was thinking a lot about technology. And then there's this book, which is just called Gestures. And I'll just show you a little bit about what's in the book by going to the table of contents. We'll come back to this, but check out this table of contents. So these are the gestures that he talks about. He's I don't even know what to call him. He's a thinker. This one's called Beyond Machines. And this is why my friend got interested in it, because he was interested in machines and thinking, how do we think about machines? And then but there's all these other ones: the gesture of writing, the gesture of speaking, the gesture of making, the gesture of loving, Some weird ones. The gesture of turning a mask around. I really like that one. The gesture of shaving. The gesture of smoking a pipe. The gesture of video. So he is writing these weird little essays about all different stuff. But even though this isn't like in a book about speech or anything, because I teach public speaking, yeah, comprehensive, yeah, eclectic, eccentric. I honestly have to say that this is probably the best account of, I just call it the gesture of speaking now. It's kind of informed my thinking so much, but it's the best account of speech in a very broad sense as a relationship to not just other people, but to a world at the same time. So without further ado, I'll just hop right in and we can see where it takes us. The complicated organs in and around the mouth, such as tongue, gums, and lips, move so as to cause the surrounding air to oscillate in ways that has been codified into systems called language. Would that be the gesture of speaking? So he just kind of like gives this thing. But there you can see that's a physical description, the oscillation of waves. And I occasionally will have somebody in a class that'll be like, oh yeah, but all of this is just kind of sound waves. And it's fun to play with that idea. Also, people think about color that way. And it's pretty clear. I mean, you don't have to know too much about auditory processing or visual processing to realize, no, it's actually not just the physical waves. There's a lot more going on than that. But even at that physical level, does that really give us a sense of what speaking is? That's what he's asking. Can we describe it at that level? Are there really specific organs that are used for speaking? Just to say the stomach is used for digestion. Or is it rather like using a fountain pen to write? Namely, that these organs developed the function of speech in the course of human evolution. That's already kind of a strange metaphor, but I think what he's trying to say there is that the organs had other uses and that they evolved the function of speech through evolution. Is the creation of linguistic convention based on organs of speech, or did these organs develop because of the convention? Or still another possibility, did the genesis of the convention and the anatomical development of the mouth occur simultaneously? And so a lot of these are kind of pretty predictable conundrums that come out from thinking about biological function, biological morphology, and trying to think about something. The idea of teleology, which is usually in science that, there's no teleology. That's kind of a religious idea. There's no end goal for something. It is difficult to think about biological function, totally separated from a religious point of view without purpose in it, because we're thinking about anatomical purpose and evolutionary selective purpose and things like that. That's what he's trying to think about. Well, what was the original purpose of the stuff that we use to speak? Did the language center in the brain perhaps realize the conventions that create language and the organs used to make it? Or was it the reverse, that the center developed out of the practice of speaking? And because organs of speech must be seen in the context of the whole body, for example, as a function of the rib cage, which is kind of a weird idea, and the brain center for language in the context of the whole brain, for example, as a center of the center for writing, as a function of the center for writing, it is perhaps the whole body the producer of linguistic convention, which is to say the so-called mind. The whole body, the producer of linguistic convention. So it's not just that there's a word and then I say, oh yeah, I have the word and its reality is some kind of mental thing and we just put it into speech. Or, it's really a spoken word and we just write it down to remember the sound. That's a way that a lot of people think about it. He's trying to say the whole body is involved. This is a hypothesis. Could it be that the whole body is involved in producing even the most basic linguistic conventions? And then he has this weird idea. Is like he calls the whole body the mind. There's a tradition to that, and it goes back. People who have taken my classes before would be like, oh my God, this guy's always on about Aristotle. But it does go back to Aristotle. Aristotle he writes a book called On the Soul, Perisuches, or it's more known by its Latin title, De Anima. And in this treatise, Aristotle defines the soul in a very peculiar way, at least to us, I think. If we think about the soul today, if we said the word soul, other than maybe good food or good music, we'd probably be thinking of a religious idea or spiritual idea where the soul is some kind of non-corporeal entity that lives on after death. These are some of the common ideas about the soul. But for Aristotle, it was precisely not that. It was corporeal, and it did die with the body. And in fact, the soul is a kind of emergent property of a body. I'm not going to give you the full definition. It's kind of weird, but it's worth looking into. It's this kind of emergent property of a body arranged for life. And so he thinks about, he's like, for Aristotle, even plants have a kind of soul that has limited function. So that is one way of thinking about the relationship of speech to the body as living, to the human body as living. Okay, man. Or must the whole body, and the organs of speech in particular, be regarded as a synthesis of material and mind, as having developed historically through a reciprocal testing of linguistic conventions and the mammalian organism, so that we could be able to claim any organ, to regard any organ, say the thumb, as belonging to a speaking mammal. Now, occasionally this one will come up and people will be like, what the hell is he talking about? But even on our phones, we have this as an emoji, don't we? The thumb up, the thumb down. There's an old kind of story that this comes from the Roman emperors in the Colosseum, that when the gladiator would ask, should I kill him? And the emperor would say yes or no. I don't know if I believe that story or not. There have been people that have done a lot of research about what the origin of that gesture is, and the results are kind of inconclusive. But that's a nice kind of story to think about where that comes from. But of course, I would say to this question, I would say, yeah, of course the thumb relates to that. There's another example of in, was it El Salvador? No, it was Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, they had a community of deaf students, and they didn't have a sign language there. So they wanted to create a school to bring all of the Nicaraguan children that were deaf so that they could teach them how to read lips. Of course, the result was the children developed their own language, not through speech, but through signs. So to me, this doesn't seem very controversial to say that the whole body, including even things like the thumb, are part of linguistic communication. And conversely, that we should regard any linguistic convention, even the most formal, such as symbolic logic, as having been achieved by a mammal equipped with thumbs. Makes sense to me. Hard to write down all those symbols, existential quantifiers, without a thumb, but you could do it in some other way. So anyway, he's trying, what really is the scope of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about speech? Can we imagine speech without imagining the whole human being? I think that's the way I would put this question. Can we imagine the existence of language without imagining the entire human being? Is it the case that no other mammal can speak because its vocal cords are not appropriate, or conversely that human vocal cords are, as they are, because specific functions of linguistic convention, logical functions, made them that way? So again, chicken or the egg? Are we able to speak because of happenstance of evolution? We have these particular organs, or do we have these organs and we develop these organs in order because the refinement of speech itself led us to select for these? Then the question would arise, why don't other animals speak, or do they speak in such a way that we can't understand them? Because their vocal cords or antennae or pseudopods were shaped by different sets of conventions or by another mind. And this is a pretty common one, I think, that we come across. Do dolphins have a language? Does whale song constitute a language? Bird song? Does the bees waggle dance constitute a language? I mean, I'm curious what you think about that, aliens or whoever is in here. Do you think that other kinds of animal communication constitute language? That's the question here. So all of these questions at the beginning kind of are like it gets a little more interesting, I think. But to sum it up, did the gesture of speaking come from the body, from the mind, from biology, from history, from phonetics, from semantics, from the speaker, or from what is said? Did the word come from speaking, or speaking from the word? So now we see what he was up to that whole time. He was trying to think about what's the origin of language, but not in a way of being like, in what moment in time did it come? He's making that as one possibility, but also we can think about that origin as at different levels. We could think about it as the origin out of the human mind, out of human biology, out of human history, out of peculiarities of phonetics and semantics, any of that. If you lie in wait, and now we get into where it's even already it starts to get even more strange. If you lie in wait for a word at the moment it comes out of the mouth, try to catch it, to chew it before it is spit out. And that would actually be to grasp the gesture of speaking. You notice that you're always a second too late. Somewhere, somehow, before pronunciation and behind the mouth, the word has already been formed. However briefly, before or after, and not somewhere, somehow in the broad stretches of eternal ideas or in the history of humanity. Let's say that the word took shape somewhere in the head, just before the complicated movement of the organs of speech. So that idea, I mean, this actually puts forward a very common idea where someone says, well, where do I get my speech from? Well, I get it from my ideas, from my thoughts. And he's saying, well, wouldn't that mean that there has to be a moment between your thinking and your speaking? Wouldn't there be something in between? So couldn't you kind of catch it, the moment just before it's spoken? What would that be like? That thing right in between. And so that would be the place to look for the gesture of speaking. That place right between mind and body. You can see why that's not going to work. But the question about the best point from which to try to catch the word from science or from experience is probably not a good one. To be caught, the word itself must rather say where it comes from, which is kind of a funny thing. You can ask the words, hey, where did you come from? Let the word speak as it takes shape behind the mouth and before it is pronounced, knowing that everything speaks more easily than the word itself. So that sounds a little bit mystical, and there's many ways to interpret this essay. He says a lot of things like this. But one way that I think about this idea of let the word speak as it takes shape behind the mouth and before it is pronounced. One way is to say that, which another philosopher said, that language speaks, that there's kind of a wisdom in language, in the word, which may not be the wisdom of the speaker, or some kind of knowledge, or some kind of meaning. And I think you experience that most clearly when you're trying to choose between words. You're trying to figure out what to say from a set of options that's more or less discrete. Sometimes it's not very discrete. And that moment where you kind of don't feel that what you have to say is perfectly right kind of tells you something about language and meaning. That it can't be simply identified with the word. And in that moment before, where that word is kind of like not quite what needs to be said, there's something to be learned from what that word is saying. The word says something else in the moment when it doesn't fit speech, which is kind of a weird idea. We don't need more than animal communication just to survive. I think complex language comes from having larger communities which began to focus on things other than just survival. That makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think that's a pretty good hypothesis of being like, if we were just doing bare necessities, we could kind of get by on grunts and hoots and hollers and things like that, right? Another idea I kind of heard once, I forgot, I should go find out who this was, but it was talking about human evolution, human primate evolution, and basically saying human beings are unique among the primates because they're not able to survive after birth without a community. So we're kind of like the abortions of nature. We shouldn't exist. And so because of that, there are lots of other things, the long-term care that has to be given to children in order to make them capable of survival is one evolutionary source for the development of language, that you need a kind of community to take care of these children. And that communal form becomes the basis of linguistic form. There's lots of ideas, lots of hypotheses about this. It's a very interesting subject. Sometimes it's more speculative than others. There's different kinds of evidence for these things, but it is pretty speculative. So Rilke here is a German poet of the 20th century who wrote a lot of, I would say, very beautiful poems. I will say they're very beautiful. Rilke says of the prophet that he spits words as Vulcan spits stones, and that he does so because the words he pronounces are not his own. Okay, so we need to remember a couple things. Vulcan, Roman deity of the hearth, but also where we get the word volcano, right? And so there's a kind of association there. But so if you think about it as just like a volcano, throwing up magma, from a geological perspective, it's doing that out of necessity, right? It can't help it. It's not its stuff, it's coming through it. And that is kind of like what we would imagine a prophet to be, right? That the speech just kind of comes through us. The prophet is an instrument, an oracle, something like that. So this idea of prophetic speech, which you might be like, but I don't believe in that. I think what he's going to say here is there's something about that idea of the prophet that relates to even what seems to be pretty normal speaking, that our words are never fully our own. But he allows himself the speculation that there is no such thing as one's own words, or hardly any, and that in speaking one is possessed by the words of others. And he doesn't say just for prophets, that's for anyone. We are always being possessed by the words of others. As William S. Burroughs put it in a funnier way, which he said something like, language is an alien from outer space. So it kind of like infects your brain. And that's what's speaking all the time, some other thing. And because these others are possessed in turn by the words of others when they speak, one could claim simply that one is possessed by words when one speaks. Should the word speak, then, it would say of itself that people don't speak but are spoken, and that groups of people do not speak a specific language, but that each language trains a group of people. Okay, so this is a pretty common rhetorical move of changing who's the agent in a situation. It's not language that is being spoken, it's language that is speaking. Who is the agent, who is the patient, who's active and who is passive in any relationship? Turns out that we can pretty much always flip those ideas because they're dialectical ideas. They're always related to each other. So we can flip them and see what it looks like from that point of view. Is it valuable? I think in this case it is. The speaking word will not allow this relationship between person and word to become dialectical, so as perhaps to suggest that words make people and people make words. So he's saying it's not dialectical in a different way, right? It's not reciprocal. The speaking word will not allow this relationship. So it's like, we make the words, but then people have their own intentions and designs, and we kind of make the words too. It goes back and forth. He's like, no, there's something about this word, the speaking word, which is different from that common relationship. In catching the word just behind the mouth and just before it is pronounced, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was in the speaker, and the Word was the speaker. Okay, of course there he's riffing off of the Christian Gospel of John, which begins famously, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh, and the Word was with God, and the Word was made flesh. Though Erasmus, I'm drinking, Erasmus, who was probably like the most famous humanist in Europe in the 16th century, probably. And even if you do like a study abroad program in Europe, the exchange programs they have, they're still called the Erasmus program. He represented kind of like international European scholarship in his time. Dürer made a print of him, that kind of a thing. He translated it into Latin differently from the Greek, because the Greek word is logos for word. And so he said, rather than in the beginning was the word, he said in the beginning was speech, sermo, because logos can also mean speech. This created a little bit of a controversy, theological controversy. So this question, why we're using word here, I think because he wants us to think about the word as what's before speech, before the moment of physically moving your mouth and making those oscillating waves. This word's pronouncement can of course be scientifically and philosophically refuted, and from the resulting mash, various psychologies, language philosophies, and communication theories can be cooked up, and may taste wonderful. But in this case, the proof of the pudding does not lie in the eating. For if we return to the word as it speaks before it is spoken, that it says again and again unmistakably, I am the seed of being. I am the breath of the deity. I am the beginning, logos. And then we get to that word logos again. This is mystical. This is just straight up mystical, right? And that's kind of why I wanted to preface it. This is not like this is not a guy who like writes religious writing in any obvious way. This is a guy who's mostly thinking about technology in his career. getting to this, maybe it's a little later on in his career, but people get more religious when they get older. I don't know. I think he's trying to say something that he feels is very urgent, very, very serious stuff. And you might say that's a posture, and maybe it is. But there's something here about how there's a divinity in the word. To get behind the vocal cords before the moment of pronunciation, to catch the gesture of speaking, is to see the word glow, even knowing that vocal cords and pronunciation will extinguish this glow. So Alien says, our complexity of thought and even our sensory perception to some extent is dependent on language. The way we see colors depends on the language we speak, and people who use sign language think in a form of sign language. So I tend to believe that thought follows language rather than the other way around. Yeah, I think that there's certainly huge parts of thinking that, as you say, follow language. And it's also hard to kind of say, like, well, what part could be separated from it? Because as he was kind of playing with earlier, is it possible to imagine someone who just does one kind of thinking, even if it's not directly influenced by linguistics? The very kind of civilization that we have, the possibility of our lives that make that kind of thinking possible is dependent on language. But even in a more direct way, many of our ideas can't be like really extricated from linguistic thought. But I think here he's not necessarily even really talking about thought. He's almost imagining language as its own being, which is a weird idea. That language is its own being. But we kind of believe that, don't we, implicitly? Because when we teach a language, there's one generation of speakers. They teach the next language. And then the old generation dies. And then there's a new generation of people speaking it. Well, they all learned the language. No one there owns the language. No one who taught it to them owned the language. And of course it develops and there are new ideas and new meanings. But the language kind of has a life that's longer than any of its speakers. Much longer in most cases. So in some weird way, like those amoebae colonies or like the tree colonies that kind of people are like, oh wow, if you look at it all together, that looks like one organism. If you think about language that way, it's like one enormous living organism. And if we think about it that way, what is it saying? That's kind of what he's asking us. What does it say? And it kind of lives in the speaker, but it also speaks. And so strangely, an observation of speaking leads to a question of silence. Yeah, I think he's gonna resist the metaphor to tool. But tool is thinking about language as tool, which is another common metaphor for language. I think the reason he would resist it is that like tool is for us. Even when we're thinking about like Paleolithic human beings, they like take a stone, but they hew it in such a way that it is for them, for their purposes. And here he's saying, no, we are the tools of language. We are hewn by language. It's not just to human purposes. It's a weird idea. I don't know what to say. It's a weird idea. Silence is, of course, not stillness, but the gesture that arrests the word before it comes into the mouth. Silence means that the word speaks rather than coming into the mouth. To grasp the gesture of speaking, one must first observe that of being silent. For in silence, the word speaks and glows. To grasp the gesture of speaking, one must learn to be silent. Now, obviously, again, here, he's not just, doesn't mean just the absence of sound or the absence of speech. He means a gesture. Doing something. Learning how to do something. I think one thing that approximates it is the moment when someone, maybe someone asks you a question and you choose not to answer. I get a lot of spam on my SMS these days, so I'm choosing not to answer. That's not a silence. Silence is when the silence is the answer. When silence responds. That's kind of a gesture of silence. But silence can respond in an aggressive way, where I'm like, I'm not talking to you, I'm giving you the silent treatment. But here, I think he's thinking about silence as a response to speech, to the possibility of speech itself. I remain in silence before the possibility of my own speech. And in doing that, I learn what speech is. The word cannot be silenced indefinitely, however. It presses against the mouth to be spoken. People speak not so much because they have something to say, as because the word pierces the wall of silence. I think people might read this in a way that's kind of confuses the attitude here. I think partly because the way that the translator put in the scare quotes, you can read it as kind of ironic. Oh, do you have something to say? I think he means it. He means that if you had something to say, that would be closer to the gesture of speaking that he's imagining. But a lot of times we just speak to fill the air, to fill the silence. And that's what he means by the word piercing the wall of silence. It doesn't actually glow. It just kind of comes out. Why do we do that? Why do we want to fill the silence? What's in the silence tells us something about language. That the thing that irritates us about the silence tells us something about language, about speech, what speaking is. The elementary facts of speaking have been forgotten in the present, it's fair to say. The gates of words are pathologically wide open, and a logorrhea of talk is flooding the area. Now, he sounds pretty grumpy here. I guess he is kind of grumpy. People talk because they no longer know how to speak. They no longer know because there's nothing to be silent about. I'll read that one again, because I think that this gets right to the heart of his attitude. People talk because they no longer know how to speak. So obviously here, talk is the inferior thing. And they no longer know because there's nothing to be silent about. There's plenty to talk about, nothing to be silent about. That's an interesting idea. What's worth being silent about? A lot of times we say today, silence is violence, or if we're silent about something, we're complicit in it. The idea being that if we speak to something, we're kind of making it more real, we're bringing attention to it, we're raising awareness. But I mean, I really think that most people, even if they say this, and there is something to that. I'm not trying to kind of denigrate that attitude. It has its place, for sure. But I think everyone has an experience in life where you come before something where you know that were you to speak, it would, as sometimes people say, ruin the moment. And that is related to this kind of whole religious feeling of this essay. Because what is that but sacrality? The sacred. The kinds of things that are worth being silent about. In other earlier times, before word inflation, there must have been a weight, a solemnity about the gesture of speech. Or one might have said a calibration of words, a measured speech as it is found among farmers who live alone, among whom speaking still counts as a break in the silence rather than an antidote to stillness. Aliens. Maybe we tend to accept the wall of silence in the company of people we are comfortable with, and the silence is mutual understanding. I think that's true. I mean, you have that experience of how intimate silence is when you can be silent with someone. That it's difficult to be silent around some people because the meaning of the silence is too filled with kind of uncomfortable possibilities. Oh, are they going to think I don't like them? I have to kind of keep up the social channel. And that sense of our relationship having to be maintained, like a kind of social relationship, civil relationship, having to be maintained by kind of constant talk, means that deep understanding, as you're kind of talking about, aliens, is not there. Yeah, so it feels like an obligation, a social obligation. Yeah, my students were talking about this earlier. They're like, oh, if I'm in an elevator and I'm like, I kind of know somebody, it's super awkward because like you're not sure if you have to talk or not, but you don't want to not talk, and what's there to talk about? Yeah, this is this problem. This original weight of the gesture of speaking, and not the frivolous gesture of talking, is under consideration here. Not the movement of the mouth organs that occurs everywhere, that sets the air of marketplaces, TVs, and lecture halls in motion, but rather the far rarer gesture that moves words from the realm of observation into the sphere of association with others. And this is the heart of the essay. I mean, the way that he kind of frames this makes it sound like this kind of grumpy old mystical thing of being like, oh, back when we used to be farmers, it was like, I know some farmers, and some of them are really talkative. So, I mean, maybe they're not. Maybe that's because they're farming and they're like, I have someone to talk to, when I see them. But I'm not sure that there's that much truth in that kind of pastoral fantasy about, the quiet, honest people, things like that. That part doesn't move me too much. But this statement of the rarer gesture that moves worlds from the realm of observation into the sphere of association with others, I think that really does capture something that I do often find to be, people seem to be missing and to miss. That if you, and it relates to this thing that people do a lot that I've noticed, which is that they like to give you facts. And as if the fact is by itself a value. That because something is true, that it does there's no other possible function for what our speech is about. I'm just conveying the truth. I'm conveying it to you. And I think that is kind of using language like a tool, not a good way. But what would it really mean to kind of take a word, which does have its role in kind of observing, referring, and things like that, to becoming a relationship with other people? And it's that kind of relationship that we have in silence that we need to find a way to put into speech. That intimate silence that we have with other people has to have an analog in the care that we take in our speech to genuinely know what the gesture of speaking could be, as opposed to talking for him. Okay, the difference between the dialogical and discursive word, so important for the analysis of speech, cannot be discerned by observing conversation. So he seems to make a kind of random jump here. Where are the footnotes? So they're all the way at the end. I really much prefer the Chicago style where it's like right at the bottom of the page for lots of reasons, but that's one of them because I don't feel like going and looking at it right now. But anyway, what's the difference between the dialogical and the discursive word? He's not really ever going to explain it, but we can make some guesses. But let's read a little bit more to see what we think he means. I can see the difference between dialogue and discourse down here, so that might be a clue. But as it breaks through the wall of silence, the word proceeds from the sphere of available words into the sphere of relationships between people, without the question of how these relationships are structured becoming significant. So again, the breaking through the wall is that, for him, that's like, it just kind of, it's not thoughtful. That's not the image of that's the thoughtless kind of talking, where I'm not thinking about the way in which, this word is fine. This word is fine, but I'm not thinking about it in relationship to other people. I'm just thinking about it as what it refers to. Is it true? That kind of a thing. The person who is speaking does direct his word toward a context. He never talks to nothing, and in this sense, his speech is always an address, a pronouncement, that is dialogic. Right, so we can now start to get a sense of the dialogical. The dialogical is between people. Yeah? The discursive is just kind of that abstraction that comes from the long life that we live in language. So that without having any particular person in mind, I can kind of give you an example of what journalistic speech sounds like, or what religious speech sounds like, or what scientific speech sounds like. Those are different discourses. But dialogue, I can't give you a sample of what dialogue sounds like. Dialogue is the thing that's happening between people. Which, in a weird way, what we're doing right now, aliens, kind of a dialogue. It's weird. It's separated because I'm got a microphone and you got a keyboard. But this is dialogical, I would say. Hopefully, it aspires to be dialogical. Yeah. But the words he formulates build chains. They are linked into one another for syntactic and semantic reasons, and in this sense, the gesture of speaking is always a discursive gesture. And so he's like, even when we're doing dialogue, of course we're doing discourse, because there are grammatical rules. There is reference to things in dialogue, That kind of part is always there. The difference between dialogue and discourse probably can be encountered only in the web of human relationships, in the political arena, and remains undecidable at the moment of speaking. The speaking person is accountable for discourse and dialogue as he is speaking. But another decision is required, namely the one between the two spheres that are divided by the wall of silence, before the gesture of speaking changed into a unity bound up with words. Super difficult, complex little part of the paragraph here. But let's try to dig into it a little bit more. The person speaking is... Okay, so this part. The difference between dialogue and discourse can only be encountered in the web of human relationships. So you can't like take a sample of the speech written out. You can't say, okay, print, computer, and then I can look at it and say, oh, is that discourse or is that dialogue? You couldn't tell from that. You gotta zoom out and see what's happening in a larger sphere. Where did that person go in the morning? What's the history of this place? We need a lot bigger context to see what kind of thing we're engaged in here. As he says, specifically the political arena. It's a question of the power relationships between people in speech is a big part of what makes the speech dialogical or not dialogical. When Bill Clinton famously said, "I feel your pain," I don't think Vilém Flusser would see that as dialogical. I think he would see that as a move in a political discourse, or I should even say political, a move in a kind of, a move in a discourse about, okay, I'm going to perform empathy in this way so I can get this demographic to vote for me. It is very practically oriented. It's a specific, concerted move in a discourse. I don't think he would think it's dialogical because I think he thinks it's not. It's not. It understands those human relationships. It's not that they don't understand the human relationships involved, but understand those human relationships instrumentally, in light of what they can do for various interested parties. Okay, so the speaker's inner space, just behind the vocal cords and just prior to speaking out, cannot be understood as a private space because it is filled with words that have an inherently public character and stem from the public sphere. One of the things I do in the class sometimes, on the first day, today was a first day for us, I ask people to say, what's your earliest memory? And as people kind of generate their earliest memories, and people ask you this question a lot, we begin to discover that those memories are really deeply informed by what other people have said. And in a way that they don't even make sense without that. Someone was telling me one today where she was, her earliest memory is playing video games with her brother, but her brother gave her a controller that was not plugged in, and she didn't know about it. Well, obviously it's not a memory of her not knowing about it. How could she remember that? So the memory is takes on another layer of what other people have said. Flusser means this in an even more radical way than what I just said. That all of our private space, our private thoughts, have a public character because they're living in the language that we have inherited that has its own set of public meanings. It's very possible for you to say a statement and other people to say, "Oh my God, I can't believe that you said that." And you're like, "What?" And you only later learn the meaning of it. Well, you're like, well, obviously the meaning of that statement, that accidentally offensive statement, isn't identical with what you thought it meant. The reason that's possible, though, why are things like that possible, is because your private space is already public. It's already totally, it's the agar of our privacy is publicity. In a weird way. It would be just as inaccurate to regard the space as some sort of topos uranikos. This means heavenly place in Greek, and it's referring to this weird part in Plato where he's the forms live in the topos uranikos, okay, in which timeless ideas are stored in logical order, for it is in fact filled with words that can, however, only become real, and so actually become ideas when they are spoken. Isn't that an interesting little statement? They can only really become ideas when they're real. So ideas. Okay, let's forget about that part. I don't want to get too much into Plato. Okay, the inner space could perhaps be best described as a kind of cybernetic memory, were it not for the danger of its being likened to a computer and so displaced into the brain. So I don't know if you know much about cybernetics. This is a theory that Flusser was pretty involved with, and I'm becoming more interested. I didn't used to be very. I was almost a little hostile towards people I knew who were like all about cybernetics, but I've recently become more interested in it again by kind of giving it another shot in a different way. It's hard to explain exactly what, even in the simple idea of what cybernetics is, but you could say something like cybernetics conceives of everything in terms of systems of communication. So a biological organism, like all of the things that are happening in the biological organism, you could think about as flows of information. And in that kind of way, you can see that the cybernetic memory that we have, our inner space, is in the same way that organisms have systems that are open to an environment. This is one of the big ideas about cybernetics, is that these are open systems, and that they become self-organizing by kind of taking in their environment and organizing that in a certain way so they can continue to live. This is the biological side of cybernetics. So he doesn't want you to think about cyber in relationship to computers, but cybernetics as that kind of memory that is generally systematic, genuinely systematic, not kind of local. Viewed objectively, that is, from an anatomical and physiological standpoint, the space has much in common with the brain and with the overall body structure of the speaker. But from such a standpoint, you can't grasp it. For what is characteristic of it is a very particular dialectic of freedom. There, available words press to be chosen to exert a function in the external space, and at the same time, the wall of silence presses, in very complex ways, in the opposite direction. This shadow realm of words that press and are pressed on is commonly known as the realm of thinking, although this terminology carries a risk of forgetting the direct connection between this space and the brain. So he doesn't want you to think about thinking, and he doesn't want you to become like this kind of philosopher that's like, oh, thought, the realm of thought where we are free, away from the materiality. Soma, sema, my body is a prison, it's like the necessity of nature against the freedom of thought. This kind of bad Kantianism. He doesn't want that. Because he's like, no, this is all physical. It's just hard to think about it if we try to think about it at the physical level. So we have to kind of find and fumble around for concepts that allow us to get to some sense of what the gesture of speaking might be. But it is physical. There's no way that it's not. And still a question arises with respect to the space. How does one think in the moment of speaking, that is, in the outer edge of thinking space? It's kind of weird. Even as I'm doing this right now and I'm doing the stream, I kind of knew going, I was like, I've read it before. I'm not going to prepare. But I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't remember it that clearly. I don't know what I'm going to say to the next paragraph. So where is this coming from, this stuff that I'm saying? For it is clear that one thinks differently there than elsewhere, in the obscure cracks and corners. This could be said more simply. Thinking, in this border situation, means choosing words that are meant to refer to specific problems in the external space to resolve them. Stated so simply, this connection cannot actually be sustained. This is a kind of way that some older writers do. They would say, that I think a lot of students find confusing, where it'd be like, here's a statement. And of course that's wrong. I don't think that people write that way anymore. But I kind of like it. They're like, here's a well-formed, here's the best formed example of a thought that once we see it in its best form, we obviously can't sustain it, which means that we have to move to another idea. But even in doing this, I think he's kind of trying to show you some instance, even though he's writing, some way in which this models the kind of thinking that happens when we're speaking. But it does give us a view of the space external to the speaker as a function of which he chooses his words. It is a space filled with problems and with other people, but it would be wrong to equate it with the world. The speaker does not speak to the world, but past the world to others. Speaking is an attempt to bypass the world, to reach others, but in such a way that the world is absorbed, spoken in the move. This might be, for me, the key sentence of the whole piece. Speaking is an attempt to bypass the world, to reach others, but in such a way that the world is absorbed, spoken in the move. So we are always speaking to people. We're always speaking to people. But we don't want to have a kind of speech where the word just pierces it and I speak it to people without thinking about those relationships. But once I think about me in relationship to other people, I see all of these problems, which involve not just other people, but the environment and history and time and all sorts of things. And so, in a weird way, my speech to people has to kind of point to those problems, but also not be I have to speak to the people. I sound really dumb I don't know how to say it better than he did. Speaking is not an attempt to bracket out the world to get at something else, but rather to catch it in words to reach another. The speaker grasps the world in words he directs towards others. So the world outside the speaker is a world that can be grasped in words, with other worlds behind it. So in a weird way, we get back to that idea of like, well, which comes first? You know, the world. Do we speak things about the world, or does the world inform our speech? You know, in a weird way, he seems to be saying that we get a world, not just an environment, but a world, as distinct from an environment, as a kind of connected set of relationships and problems and people, precisely because we have speech. Crazy stuff, but we get the world because we are speaking beings. And in speech, at the same time, we're getting past the world. We're trying to kind of capture the world as a representation for others for a particular purpose or for some relational goal, you might say. It might not be. That makes it sound like too precise, but the speaker grasps the world in words he directs towards others. So the world outside the speaker is a world that can be grasped in words. I already read this. A speaker chooses his words as a function of this very particular space, the space of graspable problems and reachable others. In short, the political space. Is that what you expected the end of that sentence to be? So, a space of graspable problems and reachable others. That's politics from his point of view. Politics isn't elections, parliaments, national borders, military equipment. It's a space of graspable problems and reachable others. So I was saying before, this is a kind of a small picture thing. I mean, it's small picture in one sense, but obviously the small picture is a picture of a big picture. But the choice cannot be taken to be a matching of available words to existing problems, an adequatio intellectus ad rem, and a kind of adequation of the intellect to the thing, which is one idea of how do we get, it's a medieval idea of truth, the truth of speech, or of ideas. And so any mechanical model, whether Aristotelian, Cartesian, or any other kind, must be abandoned. The gesture of speaking shows that this is not about touching problems with words, or about the effort to capture problems in word boxes, categories, that is. The speaker is not a hunter of problems setting up word traps, or a fisher of the world with a net of words, however much the greater part of traditional philosophy may make us want to believe it. Hell yeah. On the contrary, the speaker seeks others. His words are tentacles in the direction of others, and although the words are selected in the function of problems, the primary intention is to be understood by others. So speaker's thinking is an adequatio intellectus ad intellectum, adequation of an intellect to another intellect. And his intention is not to capture some sort of objective truth, but to make an intersubjective understanding possible. The words are indeed chosen in the function of problems, but the criterion for the choice is not the problem alone, but equally the word's comprehensibility. The gesture of speaking is not only an epistemological, but also an aesthetic gesture. This feels like a weird sentence at the end of the paragraph to me, but pretty wild stuff. Okay, so we're in the final stretch here. The complexity of choosing words can be appreciated only in light of a realization that a speaker's thinking is at least as much a function of words as of problems. back to what you were saying, that he matches problems to words at least as much as he matches words to problems. In short, that the speaker thinks as a living being and not like a scientific computer. And at least two adjoining factors can be recognized in this choice: problems that refuse to be grasped in words, and words that refuse to be spoken. And so you can see we're circling back to the silence idea. So one runs into at least two types of silence. One is that of the problems that cannot be articulated, of which Wittgenstein said, "What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence." Problems that cannot be articulated. Well, what might those be? There might be problems that can't be articulated in certain discourses, but might be in others. But I think here, Flusser's imagining problems that really cannot be articulated at all. But we might kind of have some intuition about them. We might kind of sense it in our lives in certain moments. It might be part of the kind of tragic character of life. And the other is that of unspeakable words, of which the Bible says, "Thou shalt not take the name of thy Lord thy God in vain." Let's call them epistemological, that's the first one, and aesthetic silences, that's the second one. It's weird to think of this commandment from the Bible as aesthetic, but it gives you some idea of what he's imagining by aesthetic before, when he says up here that the gesture speaking is not only an epistemological but an aesthetic gesture. I don't think it's the best choice, to be honest. He's working within a philosophical vocabulary where I think I have some intuition about why he makes that choice between epistemology and aesthetics. Unfortunately, philosophy's wrong about that, but that's okay. That's a conversation for another time. And one can identify at least two ways to break the silence: irresponsible and shameless speech. I wouldn't know anything about that. So irresponsible speech would be speech that kind of violates that inarticulableness of a problem. You say, "Oh yeah, well this is pretty close," or "Oh, who cares about those problems? Let's go to the truth that we all understand." You know, people who there's a lot of people who kind of make like lots of hasty generalizations about things, when it's not only that, like, oh, you know, it's more nuanced. It's really talking about a reality that cannot be grasped within any kind of speech. It's because of its complexity or because of its way of being different from the kinds of things that can be spoken. But there's also shameless speech. There are things that we ought not to say, things that we shouldn't say, those kinds of silences, things worth being silent about, and we say them anyway. That would be the shameless speaking. So that which speaks about things that cannot be spoken of, and that which speaks of things that should not be spoken of. The two forms of refusal to recognize human limitation. The two excesses of freedom. It makes me wonder whether this could not be related to all of that angst that we're seeing in certain political formations about speech, freedom of speech, where people feel like they're being limited in what they can say. And they don't want to feel that limit. They feel that that limit limits them, who they are as a person. And one of the responses that this might give us to that kind of discourse is, really it limits us in a much more profound way to not accept our limitations. That's kind of like kids, you know, kind of still be a child in a certain way, to not accept limitations. One of my cousins once said, like, they had to go to the bathroom. They're like, "Can you just go to the bathroom for me?" Which I still kind of think is a funny idea sometimes. Can I just do it for you? Because, you know, we end up doing a lot of things for kids. Why couldn't we do that? And in some sense, there's something quite charming and lovely about what children do when they kind of refuse their limitations, and something that I think is worth appreciating. Because when they refuse their limitations, they don't know their limitations, or they don't know the reason why they're. Is that a limitation from an authority or from possibility? You know, those kind of ideas blur, and I think that there's that same kind of force among people who feel really limited today, that they can't really distinguish between Why it would be worthwhile to sometimes refrain from speaking about something, even if the people that are telling you to not speak are not an authority over you. That those people might, however you might appreciate their arguments about it or something, you might disagree with them, there might be a reason not to speak the things you want to say. Anyway, conversely, however, one might say that the motive for speech consists in exactly this: to give voice to unspeakable problems and to say unspeakable words, to push the boundaries of the human condition, and to expand the space of human freedom. This is a different kind of refusal than what I was just talking about. It's not talking about that thing where you're like, wait, that's not out of bounds, that's in bounds. It's to transform our limitations, not to accept them as being kind of permanent, but that means transforming our nature. This means transforming what it means to be human. And finding a way to speak that would change the limits of what is possible to say would be a good goal for a lifetime, I think. This is a strange piece. I tried to teach this to a bunch of cadets, military cadets. And we had a great conversation. I'm not sure I did it justice. I'm sure that I didn't. It always kind of affects me after I read it, though. It's like, it gets better as it goes, in my opinion. Well, I'm curious what you thought about it. But yeah, that one sentence of we speak to bypass the world, but in order to absorb it and speak it to others, to me is a really captivating formulation of the kind of speech that I want to foster. A lot of different values in speaking. People have lots of different kinds of speech that they like, but that's the kind of speech that I want to foster, where we're not speaking past people and we're not ignoring the world, but we're absorbing the world and speaking it to people. So with that, I'll leave you to meditate. And this only took an hour. It's not too bad. Aliens, it was really good to have you here and to share some thoughts with you. And again, my thoughts are with you. And anytime you should want to talk without the potential for a public audience, happy to talk, or maybe to speak. All right. Good night.